In the fading light of autumn, 1847, a team of Massachusetts investigators made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Beneath the gentle hills of what locals knew as Ellington's Educational Farm, the earth gave up its terrible secret. 43 graves, small, shallow, silent, each one belonging to a child who had vanished without a trace. These were children once promised a better life, orphans between 6 and 12 years old, who had never lived long enough to see their 14th birthday. The official records told a different story, one of relocation and redemption. These children, it claimed, had been sent west to live with generous families, to start anew under wide skies and fertile lands. But the truth lay buried with them in the Massachusetts soil. What really happened was darker, colder, and far more deliberate. For nearly 20 years, Josiah and Constance Ellington had posed as philanthropists, caretakers of society's forgotten young. They ran what appeared to be a peaceful farm, school for orphans, a place where troubled children might learn skills, grow in virtue, and be molded into future citizens. But behind that neatly painted fence and smiling Sunday appearances was something far more sinister, a machine of quiet cruelty, running on forced labor and covered in pious lies. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts chose to forget this chapter. Officials buried the truth so deep in bureaucracy and silence that even most modern historians have never heard of the Ellington farm scandal. But the past has a habit of calling out, even from shallow graves. Before we trace the horrors that unfolded on that isolated property in western Massachusetts, a quick note: if stories like these resonate with you, forgotten tragedies, shadowed history, then consider sharing them. These stories matter, especially when they were once buried so deliberately. So, how did a supposed haven become a mass graveyard? We must go back to the beginning, to 1829, when the state of Massachusetts was booming. The Industrial Revolution had transformed cities like Lowell and Lawrence into hubs of textile production. Massive mills churned out fabric day and night, powered by water, steam, and human ambition. But along with industry came chaos. Factories were dangerous places. Accidents were common. Disease spread quickly in cramped tenements. Fathers died on the job. Mothers were taken by fever. And the children, hundreds of them, were left behind, homeless and unwanted, wandering soot-choked streets in search of food, shelter, or just someone to notice they were still alive. That's when Josiah Ellington stepped forward. He was 42 at the time, a former mill supervisor turned gentleman farmer. Tall, with hollow cheeks and ice-gray eyes, he carried himself like a preacher, stern, deliberate, and always in control. His wife, Constance, was no less formidable. At 38, she had a sharp jawline, a sharper tongue, and an uncanny talent for numbers. She had managed her husband's finances back when he worked at the Petton Mill, and was widely known for her business sense, though few knew exactly what that meant. Together, they owned a 200-acre plot in Berkshire County, about 30 miles from Peatsfield. The land had been in Josiah's family since the Revolutionary War, gifted to his grandfather for military service. It was scenic, even beautiful. Rolling meadows, groves of birch and maple, and a quiet stream that powered a small mill. To the untrained eye, it looked like a perfect place for children. Clean air, open fields, and moral instruction far from the sin. And smoke of the city's dot. In the spring of 1829, Josiah approached city officials in several mill towns with a proposal that seemed almost too generous to believe. He offered to take in orphan children, up to 20 at a time. He'd give them food, shelter, education, and Christian discipline. In return, the children would help out around the farm. Nothing too heavy, just light chores appropriate to their age. Best of all, the program would cost the cities next to nothing. Just $12 per child per year to cover basic stuff. It was a deal city officials could not refuse. Lowell alone had over 300 homeless children and no good way to care. For them, almshouses were overcrowded. Disease was rampant. Josiah's farm seemed like a godsend. One of the first officials to endorse the program was Dr. Samuel Harrington, Inspector of Public Welfare for Middlesex County. His report glowed with praise. Mr. Ellington is a man of Christian character, well-versed in agriculture, and patient enough to guide young minds toward honest labor. But not everyone was convinced that Reverend Daniel Parker of Lowell's First Congregational Church interviewed Josiah when he came asking for references. Even years later, Parker recalled that meeting with visible discomfort. He spoke of children the way a farmer might speak of cattle. He would later say, "Useful, yes, manageable, but replaceable if they failed to thrive." Still, the need outweighed the doubts. And so, in June of 1829, the first group of children arrived at Ellington Farm. Among them was Timothy Caldwell, an 8-year-old boy from Boston. His parents had perished in a mill fire that past winter. Small for his age, but clever and eager, Timothy could read basic sentences and count to 100. His caseworker, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, believed he had real potential. "Timothy shows spirit," she wrote. "He will thrive in a wholesome rural setting under steady moral guidance." But what Timothy found was anything but wholesome. The children's quarters were not in a sunny loft or warm classroom. They were shoved into the basement of the farmhouse, a cold, damp space with stone walls that leaked even in dry weather. 22 children shared a single storage room. They slept on straw mats rarely changed and never cleaned. The only window was smaller than a bread box. Mornings began before sunrise, with Constance banging a metal pot to wake the children. They had 10 minutes to dress, no washing, no dawdling. Breakfast was a thin cornmeal gruel, maybe a piece of stale bread if they were lucky. Complainers lost their next meal. Work began immediately and lasted until after sunset. Even 6-year-olds were made to toil in the fields, picking apples, hauling water, clearing rocks. Smaller children were used to clean the mill's machinery, where tiny fingers often met with sharp gears. 3 weeks in, Timothy's luck ran out. While cleaning debris from the grinding stones, his left hand was crushed, 2 fingers mangled. The wounds grew infected. In pain and barely able to move, Timothy begged for rest. Josiah's solution? Lock the boy in a storage shed with nothing but water. No food, no medicine, no mercy. Timothy, Josiah later wrote in his private journal, was learning the consequences of carelessness. He continued, "Coddling children only breeds weakness. Discipline shapes survivors." It was the first injury, but it would not be the last. And for one little girl named Sarah Brennan, there would be no recovery at all. Her name was Sarah Brennan. She arrived at the Ellington farm on a sweltering August morning in 1829. Just 2 months after Timothy Caldwell. She was 10 years old, red-haired, freckle-faced, and newly orphaned. Her mother, a seamstress from Fall River, had died of tuberculosis that summer. With no other family to care for her, Sarah was placed into the system and handed off to Josiah Ellington's charitable institution, with the hope that she would be safe, educated, and eventually adopted by a family headed west. Sarah had always been described as spirited but obedient. Her caseworker noted her natural skill with needlework and her ability to stay calm under pressure, the sort of girl who could thrive in the right household. But the Ellingtons weren't offering a household. They were offering a trap. And Sarah walked straight into it. At first, Sarah tried to stay hopeful. She smiled at the other children, followed the rules, and worked diligently in the fields. But the toll of starvation sets in fast when you're a growing child asked to labor from sunrise to sunset. Within weeks, her cheeks hollowed. Her hair began falling out in clumps. Her teeth loosened. Her eyes dimmed. The fire inside her, the spark that once made her a favorite among the city charity workers, began to flicker. She could no longer keep up with the others during chores. Her thin legs trembled as she tried to carry buckets of water. Her arms shook under the weight of an apple crate. When she stumbled or fell behind, Constance Ellington noticed. And once Constance decided you were a drain on resources, you were marked. Sarah's food was cut further. Her voice, once quick and polite, grew quiet. She wasn't allowed to sit with the others during mealtimes anymore, such as they were. And then, one morning, she was simply gone from the group. The children whispered that she had been moved to the back cellar, a smaller room behind the basement's main quarters, colder, darker, and rarely opened. Those who dared sneak close to the door at night said they could hear her crying, soft at first, then desperate. But if anyone tried to slip her a crust of bread or a stolen cup of water, they were punished severely, locked in the root cellar for days, beaten, denied meals. The message was clear. Helping Sarah was dangerous. And so she lay in that room, alone, fading, until one October night when the crying stopped for good. Sarah Brennan died on October 15th, 1829. No doctor was called. No death certificate filed. Number. Burial recorded. Instead, Josiah wrote a letter. He addressed it to the Boston Placement Agency. In elegant penmanship, he claimed that Sarah had been successfully relocated. According to him, she was now living with a prosperous family in Ohio. Good Christian folk, traveling west to settle new land. The letter described her new life in loving detail. A pony, a schoolhouse nearby, a mother figure who baked fresh bread every morning. The agency believed every word. So convincing was Josiah's forgery that the social workers in Boston actually sent back a letter of congratulations, praising the Ellingtons for their commitment and success. They even marked Sarah's file completed. That night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, Josiah and Constance carried Sarah's lifeless body out to the oak grove behind the farmhouse. They dug a small grave beneath the trees, wrapped her in a wool blanket, and covered her over with dirt and silence. It was the first burial, but not the last. By the time snow fell that winter, a pattern had begun to form. One or two children would quietly disappear every few months, their names erased from the logbook, their stories rewritten. Always the same explanation: adopted, relocated, thriving somewhere far away. And the children who remained quickly learned that asking questions was not only dangerous, it was deadly. Timothy Caldwell, still recovering from his crushed fingers, watched in silence as child after child vanished. His face, once bright and eager, now held a permanent look of guarded wariness. He stopped speaking unless spoken to. He avoided eye contact. And when caseworkers visited, which was rare, he said nothing about the cellar, or the hunger, or the missing beds. Caseworkers wrote it off as shyness, or adjustment issues. Mr. Ellington always had a ready explanation. "This is normal," he'd say with a soft smile. "Children need time to settle into discipline. Some take longer than others." What the caseworkers didn't see were the punishments, the way children were forced into silence. The root cellar became a threat whispered among them, dark, airless, lined with dirt and mice, and just enough scraps of bread to keep a child alive for a day or two. And if you cried, you were left longer. Those who got sick were simply isolated, quarantined in the back storage rooms, and left to fend for themselves. If they recovered, they were allowed back into the group. If they didn't, they disappeared. Their names were replaced with neat little notes. Sent west, joined family in Indiana, adopted by settlers. The lies stacked up like stones. And no one asked where the bodies were going. What made the Ellington operation so effective and so insidious was its careful maintenance of dual realities. The first was the one shown to outsiders: a clean logbook, tidy children with scrubbed faces and forced smiles, and stories of success. Constance kept those records meticulously, always ready for inspections, complete with fake letters and cheerful updates. But there was another set of records, hidden, written in Josiah's own hand, tucked behind a false panel in the fireplace, of his study. That ledger told the truth: names, dates of death, causes, often starvation, sometimes infection. It even noted the location of each grave, mapped carefully across the farm's back acres dot by 1832. Only 3 years into their operation, 27 children had already died under their care. Yet, on paper, nearly all of them had moved on to better lives. According to the Ellingtons' official reports, 39 of the 41 children placed with them had been adopted. A miraculous success rate. Too miraculous. But the towns were overwhelmed. Caseworkers were spread thin. Letters traveled slowly. And Josiah knew exactly how to exploit the system. There were no centralized records, no interstate coordination. If he said a child had gone to Missouri or Kansas, there was no way to confirm it. Even the few who felt uneasy, like Reverend Parker, had no proof. Meanwhile, Josiah continued to attend town meetings, donated to the local church, spoke eloquently about the burden of caring for the wayward young. And people believed him. Why wouldn't they? It was only the children who knew. Only they understood that the farm was not a home, or a school, or a mission. It was a machine, one that took in broken children and turned them into laborers until they broke again. And when they could give no more, they vanished into the ground beneath the trees. And somewhere, deep in the cellar, Sarah Brennan's ghost still lingered. By the time 1833 rolled around, Ellington Farm had taken on a strange rhythm. From the outside, it seemed steady, even admirable. Children came, children left, the cycle repeated. But for those who lived inside its boundaries, there was no rhythm. Only dread. New children arrived every few months. They always came the same way, wide-eyed, confused, clutching a small bundle of clothes. Most thought they were being sent to a better life. Some believed it, at least at first. But within a week, the truth settled over them like dust. They were not guests. They were not students. They were labor, and they were expendable. The farmhouse held no warmth. Its gray clapboard siding had begun to fade. The shutters hung loose. But it was the inside that held the real rot. Stone walls that sweated year-round. The sharp smell of unwashed bodies and damp straw. Children crammed together like animals, not just in their sleeping quarters, but at mealtimes during work, even while using the single outhouse, where a line of tired, silent children stood. In the cold, the days were long. The nights were longer. And by now, the children had stopped crying when someone disappeared. They didn't talk about it, not aloud. But sometimes, if you were quiet, you could hear the whispers in the fields. Where did Mary go? Did Thomas really get adopted? Why did they take Hannah's shoes, but not her clothes? They whispered because they were afraid, not just of Josiah or Constance, though there was plenty to fear, but of the silence itself, of the fact that, deep down, they knew the answers. The farm was swallowing them. Josiah kept things running with terrifying efficiency. Every morning, he'd walk the perimeter of the property with a leather ledger tucked under one arm and a long walking stick in the other. He counted heads, watched work, took notes. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. One look from those ice-gray eyes was enough. And Constance? She ruled the kitchen and the numbers. She tracked everything. How many bowls of gruel were served? How many pounds of apples were harvested? how many socks were mended, and by whom. Her chalkboard hung in the kitchen like a scoreboard, tracking quotas. If you missed your mark, your meal was cut in half the next day. No, one missed twice. But cracks were starting to show. The problem wasn't just the growing number of graves behind the farmhouse. It was the way the older children began to change. You could see it in their eyes, the blank stare, the quiet obedience. Some were only 10 or 11, but their faces looked like they belonged to factory men, hardened, sallow, exhausted. They didn't talk much anymore. They just worked, ate, slept, and waited. And then came the drought. The summer of 1836 hit western Massachusetts hard. The rain stopped. The stream that powered the mill slowed to a crawl. The pastures turned brown. The trees dropped their leaves early. Farmers all across Berkshire County tightened their belts, praying for relief. At Ellington Farm, things went from bad to worse. Without the stream, the mill couldn't run. Without the mill, there was no income. Without income, Josiah faced a crisis, one that threatened to unravel the entire operation. But his solution wasn't prayer or planning. It was subtraction. He needed fewer mouths to feed. That summer, 7 children died. One by one. Their bodies, weakened by years of malnutrition, couldn't handle the additional strain. They collapsed in the fields, passed out during work. Some simply didn't wake up. Among the dead was Timothy Caldwell. He had survived his first winter at the farm, survived the crushed hand, the hunger, the cold. He had become quiet, cautious, older than his years. He watched everything. And the younger children followed him, trusted him. Maybe that's what made him dangerous. But the drought didn't spare anyone. Timothy's strength had been slipping for months. His limbs were thin, his skin pale. He could no longer carry the heavier baskets. On August 17th, he collapsed during morning work. By nightfall, he was unconscious. The next day, he was gone. They buried him behind the house. Same place as Sarah. No stone, no ceremony. Just a shallow pit beneath the oaks. Timothy's death should have raised questions. He was one of the few children still under formal observation by a Boston charity. His caseworker, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, expected updates. She had received letters every Christmas, handwritten by Timothy himself. Except, of course, they hadn't been written by him. Constance had forged each one. She had mastered the boy's shaky script, knew his favorite phrases. She even invented stories about how much he loved the country life. He was always happy, always grateful, always too busy to write more. But in 1836, no letter came. Mrs. Hartwell waited, then waited, longer. And eventually, she wrote to Josiah. Her letter was polite, concerned. She simply asked for confirmation that Timothy was well and still residing at the farm. Nothing more. Josiah replied within a week. His letter was, as always, warm and filled with praise. He informed her that Timothy had been successfully placed with a Methodist family traveling to the Kansas Territory. According to the letter, the boy was excited for the journey and had asked that Mrs. Hartwell be thanked for her kindness. It was convincing, too convincing, because Mrs. Hartwell knew Timothy. And Timothy had never once expressed a desire to leave Massachusetts. Nor had he ever used words like grateful for the opportunity to seek his future in the West. She didn't believe it. So she got in a carriage and rode to the Ellington farm. Her arrival on September 23, 1836, was unexpected. Constance was in the kitchen when she saw the buggy approach. She froze, then quickly sent a child, a small boy named Peter, running into the fields to fetch Josiah. When Josiah appeared, he was sweating despite the cool air. Mrs. Hartwell stepped down from her carriage and got straight to the point. "I've come to see Timothy Caldwell," she said. I'd like to speak with him myself. Josiah hesitated. Just a beat. But it was enough. I'm afraid you've just missed him, he said. The Thorntons, that's the family who adopted him. Left last week. Methodist folk. Very devout. Mrs. Hartwell raised an eyebrow. You mentioned a Methodist family in your letter, but not their name. Are the Thorntons new correspondents of yours? He nodded quickly. Too quickly. Yes. I must have neglected to include their name. Oversight on my part? But she wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes had drifted to the children working just beyond the garden. Small, thin figures moving slowly, silently, under the watchful eye of an older boy with a stick. They looked nothing like the cheerful, thriving children described in Josiah's letters. I'd like to speak to a few of them, she said, her voice suddenly steel. Josiah's smile faltered. What followed was something no inspector had done. Before, an impromptu, unannounced evaluation of the Ellington operation dot, and what Mrs. Hartwell found would change everything. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell wasn't the kind of woman who was easily misled. She had spent years working with displaced children across Massachusetts, reading the faces of liars and the letters of the desperate. She knew when something didn't add up. And on that gray September afternoon in 1836, nothing about the Ellington farm felt right. From the moment she stepped out of her carriage, the energy shifted. Josiah's polished charm couldn't hide the nervous flicker in his eyes. Constance stayed out of sight, rattling dishes in the kitchen, pretending not to listen to every word. And the children, those children, they were too quiet, too still, too thin. I would like to speak to some of the other children, she repeated, walking past Josiah before he could offer another excuse. Preferably those who arrived around the same time as Timothy. He trailed behind her, mouth tight, eyes scanning the yard as if searching for a way to block her path. I assure you, he said softly, they've all been well cared for. But she didn't answer. She had already reached the garden. The children looked up as she approached, startled by the sudden presence of someone they didn't know, someone who didn't belong. A girl dropped her basket of wilted turnips. A younger boy stepped behind an older one. Hiding his face, Mrs. Hartwell stopped. Her gaze moved slowly from child to child. Their clothes hung off their frames. Their arms were marked with bruises and scratches that told stories no one had written down. Their shoes, if they had any, were too small or too worn to offer real protection. And not one of them smiled. What's your name? She asked a boy who looked no older than 9. Thomas, he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. And? How long have you been here? He looked to Josiah before answering, then whispered, Since last winter. Have you seen Timothy Caldwell recently? Thomas hesitated. A pause long enough to mean something. Then, a single word. No. No elaboration. No explanation. Josiah stepped in quickly, clapping a hand on the boy's shoulder. Thomas was. Never especially close with Timothy, he said with forced warmth. Children come and go so often, it's hard to keep track. But Mrs. Hartwell wasn't listening to Josiah anymore. Her attention had moved to a girl standing near the edge of the group. She looked pale, thinner than the others, if that was even possible. Her lower lip trembled, and she clutched a piece of cloth so tightly in her fist it looked ready to tear. Dear, Hartwell said gently, do you know what happened to Timothy? The girl's eyes widened. Her chin quivered. And then, unexpectedly, she began to cry. Not loud sobs, not even full tears, but a quiet, uncontrollable weeping. When Mrs. Hartwell crouched beside her and asked again, the girl only whispered, He got sick. And then he went away. We're not supposed to talk about the ones who go away. That sentence hit harder than any accusation. We're not supposed to talk about the ones who go away. Mrs. Hartwell stood slowly, her mind racing. Something terrible was happening here. Something that had been hidden for years under the guise of moral instruction and rural discipline. She turned to Josiah. "I'd like to inspect the living quarters." His jaw clenched. "They're not suitable for visitors at the moment. Renovations." "I wasn't asking." Without waiting, she stepped toward the house. Josiah followed, helpless now to stop what was unfolding. The moment she stepped inside the farmhouse, the smell hit her. Dampness, sweat, rot. She moved past the tidy parlor, past the forced order of Constance's kitchen, and toward the stairway leading to the basement. At the bottom, she found what the letters never mentioned. The sleeping area was worse than she imagined. Stone walls, leaking moisture, straw mats blackened with mildew, a single window no larger than a dinner plate. Rats scurried from corners as her boots tapped the floor. There were no books, no toys, no signs of learning or comfort, just blankets piled in corners and the faint scent of sickness. This wasn't education. It was containment. She counted beds, too few for the number of children she'd seen. She noted the scratches on the walls, the broken furniture, the absence of any proper sanitation. And when she asked a small boy how often they were allowed to bathe, he only shrugged. "There's soap on Sundays," he said. "If there's water." Mrs. Hartwell stayed for 3 hours. She inspected the rooms. She questioned children. She made notes in her journal, detailed and damning. The picture that emerged was horrifying. Severe malnutrition, untreated injuries, cramped, unsanitary quarters, a climate of fear and forced silence, no medical oversight, no educational instruction, no clear records of departures or adoptions. The children didn't know where their missing peers had gone. Some were told they'd been taken away by families. Others were told nothing at all. The story Josiah Ellington had sold to Massachusetts' public welfare system was unraveling. That night, back at her lodgings in Pittsfield, Mrs. Hartwell wrote the first pages of a report that would eventually find its way to the Massachusetts Board of State Charities. She titled it plainly, "Initial Observations Regarding Ellington Farm and the Welfare of its Resident Children." In that document, she wrote, "This institution presents itself as a charitable refuge, but its true conditions reveal severe neglect and likely abuse. I believe with growing certainty that the children listed as relocated or adopted have instead met with tragic fates. There is no documentation, no accountability, and no evidence that even half of the children claimed to have been placed ever left this farm alive." But Mrs. Hartwell also understood the system she was writing into. She knew investigations were slow, that government officials were overwhelmed, that documents could be buried, voices ignored. So she made a decision. She would not stop. She contacted other charities, sent copies of her report to multiple offices. She pressed local judges, spoke to church leaders, wrote to newspapers under a pseudonym. And everywhere she turned, she asked the same question. Where are the children? Back at Ellington Farm, Josiah and Constance knew the tide was turning. That visit had changed things. The story was no longer under their control. And for the first time in years, Josiah Ellington began to feel fear. Because if Mrs. Hartwell had seen this much in just 3 hours, what would she uncover if she came back? And what would happen if the graves behind the farmhouse were ever found? The first frost of 1836 came early. It crept over the hills in silence, settling over Ellington Farm like a warning. The fields hardened, the sky turned pale, and the wind began to whisper through the trees. But inside the farmhouse, something colder was taking shape. A plan. Josiah Ellington understood what was coming. Mrs. Hartwell's visit had pierced the illusion he'd so carefully maintained. Her questions, her notes, her unwavering stare, they had cracked the surface. And cracks, once formed, have a way of spreading. The only question was how much time he had left. He and Constance debated it for days, speaking in hushed tones behind closed doors. Josiah paced the study, reviewing ledgers. Constance ran her fingers along the chalkboard in the kitchen, erasing names, adjusting quotas. The threat wasn't just exposure. It was survival. There were still 11 children on the farm dot, and every one of them was a witness. They knew too much, had seen too much. If even one of them talked, if one child was relocated and decided to speak freely, the entire operation would unravel. The graves, the records, the money, all of it. Josiah's conclusion was simple, brutal, and final. The children could not be allowed to leave, but they couldn't all vanish at once. That would raise questions. Instead, it would happen quietly, gradually, over time. And the winter, he realized, gave him the perfect cover. Storms, isolation, sickness. These things would provide the silence he needed. The first to go was Peter Hoffman. He was the smallest among them, just 7 years old. He had only been at the farm a few months, still young enough to ask questions without realizing the danger of doing so. One night in December, he developed a persistent cough that disturbed the others' sleep. Josiah's journal recorded the moment like an entry in an accounting book. December 18th, the Hoffman boy is disrupting rest. Isolated him in the root cellar. The winter cold should expedite matters. Peter was never seen again. Next came Mary Sullivan. Bright, inquisitive, and dangerously observant, Mary had always pushed too hard. She asked about Timothy, about Sarah, about the children who used to sleep in the beds that now sat empty. She wasn't defiant, just curious. But in a place like Ellington Farm, curiosity was a death sentence. Josiah noted it plainly. January 4th, Mary continues asking about the others. Curiosity makes her unsuitable, reduced rations by half. She lasted another 2 weeks. By February, the number of children had dropped to 6. The rest of the farm continued as normal. Or at least it appeared to. Josiah still wrote letters to the placement agencies. Constance still reported on progress. Fake names, fake stories. She even sent a batch of holiday updates to the Boston office. Cheerful notes about Christmas. Hymns, snowball fights, and new homes on the horizon. But behind the house, the oak grove was growing. By March 1st, only 3 children remained. They were quiet, half-starved shadows. No longer playing, no longer asking questions. They did what they were told, moved where they were directed, and kept their eyes low. Constance no longer needed to shout. There was no energy left for resistance. Josiah, meanwhile, had begun spreading rumors. He told neighbors that the farm was closing, that he and Constance were planning to move west. Missouri, perhaps, or Arkansas. Somewhere with more fertile land, less oversight, better opportunities. He thanked the community for their support over the years and promised to continue his work among the frontier's needy. He told the same story to everyone, merchants, pastors, old contacts in town. They all believed him. Why wouldn't they? Josiah had always been polite, respectable, generous with his time and tithes. A godly man doing God's work. The lie served 2 purposes. First, it explained why the children would soon be gone. Second, it prepared for the Ellingtons' disappearance. Because they didn't. Planned to stay. Not in Massachusetts. Not with graves behind the house. The final journal entry was dated March 15, 1837. It read, "The Lord's work is complete. Tomorrow we begin our new life." By the time the snow melted, Ellington Farm stood empty. No laughter, no crying, no children. Only silence. The fields, once kept by the hands of dozens of small workers, were beginning to reclaim themselves. Grass pushed through frost. Weeds choked the vegetable beds. And the oaks stood quiet, their roots winding through the soil, beneath which lay the remnants of innocence. The Ellingtons were gone. No forwarding address. No goodbye. They had simply vanished, leaving behind a farmhouse full of lies and an orchard full of graves. But the story didn't end there. Mrs. Hartwell's report had already begun to circulate. It reached the Massachusetts Board of State Charities. It passed across the desk of judges and inspectors. And with each new pair of eyes, the concern deepened. Where were the children? Why had the record stopped? And how could one farm, in all its years of operation, fail to produce even a single documented adoption recipient? The math didn't add up. The files were too clean. The letters too perfect. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then came Jacob Fletcher, the traveling tinker who had serviced the farm's pots and pans for nearly a decade, had begun asking questions of his own. When he heard rumors that the Ellingtons had moved west, he looked for proof. But no wagons had been hired, no household goods packed, no bookings registered on the western routes. To Fletcher, that meant only one thing. They hadn't left. Not really. In the summer of 1837, Fletcher made his way back to the abandoned property. The grass was high. The front door swung loosely on its hinges. Wind moved through the house like a breath held too long. He walked the fields, circled the mill, and finally stood beneath the oaks behind the house. There, he saw what others had. Mist, patches of land that were subtly different. Slight mounds, replanted grass that didn't match the surrounding growth. The kind of details that only an old tradesman might notice, and that only someone with reason to suspect would bother to interpret. They were graves, too many to count. Too quiet to ignore. Fletcher left that day with something heavier than suspicion. He left with certainty. The Ellington farm had not been a sanctuary. It had been a slaughterhouse, dressed in prayer and piety. And somewhere, beneath that soil, were the voices of children still waiting to be heard. A decade passed before the truth clawed its way out of the earth. 10 quiet years where Ellington Farm stood abandoned. Its windows shuttered, its fields overtaken by weeds, its name erased from the light conversation. Locals said little. Those who knew something whispered. Those who didn't avoided the place altogether. But not everyone forgot. In Alston, Mrs. Hartwell continued to press the state for answers. Her reports had reached the desks of important men, but they rarely acted. Too many missing records. Too many assumptions. Too much distance between truth and evidence. Until 1847, when a half-mad woman in Hartford started talking about graves. Her name was Constance Ellington. Living under an alias in a run-down boarding house, she'd become a shadow of her former self. Josiah had died in 1843, taken by pneumonia. With no husband, no money, and no institution left to manage, she unraveled. Her neighbors described her as devout, reclusive, and haunted. She wandered from church to church, mumbling to herself, scribbling nonsense on scraps of paper. Then one day, she whispered something that caught someone's attention. 43, she said. 43 little souls. We buried them where the wildflowers grow. We said it was God's will. A reverend named Thomas Hayes listened. Unlike others, he didn't dismiss her as another fevered widow. He took notes, asked questions, and after hearing the same confession a second time, this one more vivid, more detailed, he sent word to the Massachusetts authorities. That was when the Commonwealth finally moved. In September of 1847, investigators from Boston, joined by local law enforcement and medical examiners, descended on the long-forgotten Ellington farm. The house groaned as their boots crossed the warped floorboards. Vines clung to broken shutters. The air smelled of dust, mold, and old secrets. They began with the land. Jacob Fletcher guided them to the grove behind the farmhouse. The trees stood tall and still, untouched but not undisturbed. Surveyors marked out suspicious patches of ground. Shovels struck earth. And on the second day, they found the first coffin dot. It was small, simple, half-dash rotted dot inside was the skeletal frame of a child, no more than 10. Around the remains, fragments of cloth. On one piece, stitched letters, S.B. Sarah Brennan. Over the next 3 weeks, they uncovered 42 more, some buried 2 to a box, others wrapped in blankets, bones curled together as if trying to keep warm. Most showed signs of malnutrition. Some had broken bones that had never healed. A few still had traces of infection in their tiny skulls, but none had been reported dead. Not a single one. They weren't just victims. They were erased. While one team worked the fields, another turned their attention to the farmhouse. They searched the walls, the floors, the cellar, the barn, and then, behind the fireplace in Josiah's study, they found it. A false panel built into the brick. Behind it, wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine, were 2 books. One was a journal, the other a ledger. Together they told the real story. The ledger was chilling in its precision. It listed every child sent to the farm, arrival dates, assigned tasks, health notes, and eventually, causes of death. The margins were filled with cold, practical notes. How long a child could work before showing signs of weakness. How much food could be reduced before illness appeared. How many days it took a body to decompose in different weather conditions. It wasn't a diary. It was a blueprint for murder. The journal was worse. Josiah had written in a neat, deliberate hand, page after page of reflections, justifications, and calculations. He spoke of the children not as people, but as resources, units, investments. He debated, on paper, whether feeding a sick child for 2 weeks was worth the risk of them surviving. He wrote about the noise they made when locked in the root cellar. How silence was a better teacher than sympathy. One entry read, a mortality rate of 20% per year can be explained. Anything over 30% requires more elaborate lies. He had calculated the optimal death rate, not for profit. Josiah's deception had run deeper than anyone imagined. He had continued collecting government subsidies for years after some children had died. He forged letters, faked signatures, sent glowing reports of thriving children to agencies that never bothered to verify. In some cases, he claimed payments for the same child for 5 years after they were buried beneath the oak trees. And through it all, Constance helped. She had copied the letters, cooked the meals, kept the false records, selected which children would eat less, which would sleep in the cold, which would disappear. In her confession, recorded in Hartford days before she was taken into custody, she said, "The first deaths were accidents. But once we buried them, once we'd lied the first time, we couldn't stop. It became easier. Each lie made the next one more necessary." But her tone shifted later in that same interview. She said, "Eventually, we stopped seeing them as children. They were mouths, shadows, disappointments. If they cried too much, they vanished. If they asked too many questions, they disappeared. We told ourselves it was mercy, that God wanted strong souls. But really, we just didn't want the burden." The evidence was overwhelming. The investigators returned to Boston with the journal, the ledger, and photographs of the graves. Constance Ellington was charged with 37 counts of murder, along with fraud and conspiracy. The state buried Josiah in disgrace, not in the cemetery, but in memory. In July of 1848, the trial began. Courtrooms filled. Newspapers printed every detail. Witnesses came forward, including Jacob Fletcher and Mrs. Hartwell. Experts testified. Records were shown. And when the jury returned, they found her guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life in prison. She served 12 years. before dying of tuberculosis in her cell. In her final days, guards said she spoke to herself often, whispering apologies to invisible children, rocking back and forth with an old Bible pressed to her chest. She said their names over and over. Again, Timothy, Sarah, Peter, Mary, and they. Rest, whose names had been stolen, but whose stories had finally been found. By the spring of 1848, the Ellington farm was no longer just a place on the map. It had become something else, a wound, a name that brought silence to conversations, a symbol of betrayal so deep, even those who had once praised the farm now avoided speaking of it at all. But the land itself remembered. After the trial, the state of Massachusetts took possession of the property, not for development, not for profit, but for something else, a reckoning. Officials debated what to do with the farmhouse and the land surrounding it. Some wanted it torn down, leveled, and forgotten. Others argued for a lasting reminder, a way to ensure that what happened there would never happen again. In the end, memory won. The house was demolished. The fields were left to the wild. But behind the farmhouse, in the grove where the graves were found, a cemetery was built, not hidden, not private, but open and marked. Each child was given a headstone, 43 stones, white granite. No more mass graves, no more initials, sewn into rotting cloth. Just names where known, ages, dates when available. And beneath each, a body that had once been denied even that most basic dignity. To be remembered. At the center of the grove stood a tall memorial. The inscription read, "In memory of 43 children who came seeking hope and found only suffering. May their names endure longer than their silence." Families from nearby towns visited often, not because they had lost a child there, but because they could have. Because every headstone marked not just a victim, but a failure. By the system, by the state, by society itself. People brought flowers. Some brought toys. One woman, herself an orphan raised in a nearby institution, left a child's blanket at the base of the tallest oak. She returned every year on the same day. When asked why, she only said, "They should have had someone." But, even with the physical space acknowledged, something lingered. Locals claimed the land was never quite right. After that, birds refused to nest in the oak grove. Horses balked at riding near it. One groundskeeper, a practical man not given to superstition, quit after only a month. He told his supervisor, "It's not the dead that bother me. It's the feeling that they're still waiting for justice, for peace, for someone to tell the rest of their story." In Boston, Mrs. Hartwell never stopped telling it. The Ellington case changed her. Once a quiet, methodical social worker, she became something else entirely. An advocate, a reformer, a voice. She gave lectures, wrote essays, spoke at meetings filled with lawmakers and public servants who were forced to look her in the eye as she described what happened to children under their watch. In one speech, she said, "We failed them because we trusted paperwork over presence. We believed letters over listening. We assumed good men don't do bad things. That mistake cost 43 lives." Her efforts led to real change. Massachusetts overhauled its child welfare system. New laws were passed requiring surprise inspections of private institutions. A central registry was created to track all placements and follow-up visits. No more unchecked ledgers, no more disappearing children, and no more men like Josiah Ellington slipping through the cracks. But what the Ellingtons had done wasn't unique, not entirely. Their case became the first in a series of investigations. With new inspection laws in place, the state discovered similar, though less deadly, abuses in other institutions. Unsanitary conditions, overcrowding, corporal punishment disguised as moral correction. The illusion of care cracked wide open. The Ellington case had torn the veil off the system, and the country was watching. Newspapers from New York to Chicago covered the story. Not just the trial, but the aftermath, the reforms, the memorial, the lingering questions. One editorial in the Boston Evening Transcript read, "What happened in the hills of Berkshire County should remind us that charity, when left unexamined, can become cruelty in disguise. We must not assume goodness. We must verify it." And yet, despite all the reform and public mourning, the question still echoed. How had it gone on for so long? How could a man and a woman, respected, even admired, create such horror under the banner of Christian virtue? The answer, many would later say, lay not in evil, but in indifference. It wasn't just what Josiah, Constance did. It was what everyone else didn't do. The officials who never followed up. The caseworkers who believed every letter. The townsfolk who looked the other way. The ministers who blessed a man without knowing his home. It was a collective silence, a refusal to ask the hard questions. And it was that silence, more than anything else, that buried those children long before the dirt did. As for Jacob Fletcher, the traveling tinker whose questions sparked the final investigation, he never sought attention. He continued his rounds, fixing kettles, sharpening, blades staying mostly quiet. But those who knew him said he was never the same. He'd stop at farms, smile at the children, ask them how they were treated. He'd look in their eyes a little longer than most strangers would. And if something felt off, he spoke up. Evil, he once said in a public meeting, doesn't always show its teeth. Sometimes it hides behind scripture, behind supper, behind a smile. He died in 1853. His tools were found packed neatly in his cart, along with a folded piece of paper tucked inside a tin bread box. On it, written in his uneven hand, were the words, "Tell the truth. Even if it's too late for them, tell it anyway." Today, few remember the Ellingtons by name, but the oak grove still stands. The headstones remain. Visitors still come, some to grieve, some to reflect, some just to witness, and almost all of them say the same thing as they leave. I didn't know, but now they do. By the time the final shovelful of dirt was packed above the last child's grave, Massachusetts had begun to reckon with the truth it didn't want to face, that a horror of this scale had taken root not in the shadows, but in plain sight. Ellington's scandal changed laws. Yes, it spurred reforms and rewrote policy, but there were deeper, quieter consequences too, ones that never made the papers. In small towns, in crowded drawing rooms, in back rows of churches, people began to ask themselves uncomfortable questions. Not about the Ellingtons, about themselves. Why didn't we ask more? Why didn't we visit the farm sooner? Why did we believe those letters? And perhaps most haunting of all, would we have believed the children, even if they had told us? The state moved quickly to seal what it found. The trial records, the photographs, the journals, even the original copies of the forged letters. Everything was collected, cataloged, and placed under restricted access. In 1850, a court order made it official. The documents were sealed for 100 years. The reason, according to the official brief, was to preserve the dignity of the victims and prevent sensationalism. But off the record, it was clear. Massachusetts wanted to put the Ellington name to rest, permanently. Only a few copies of the documents remained outside that vault, scattered across private collections. Most of them were destroyed or lost to time, but not all. One handwritten transcript of Josiah's journal, kept by a junior investigator, would later resurface in the 1940s, and with it came the slow reopening of a case long buried, not just by soil, but by silence. For decades, the site sat quiet. Trees grew taller. Grass thickened. The farmhouse was gone, torn down in 1852, its foundations left to the earth. But the oak grove remained, like a scar that never fully faded. People still visited. Some left flowers. Others brought candles. Once, someone carved the word "Y" into the bark of the largest tree. No one ever claimed it. The memorial stones, cleaned once a year by volunteers, stood vigil against time. But not everyone believed the full story had been told. Some suspected the number of children might have been higher than 43. That, other graves, older, deeper, or simply hidden better, still waited to be found. And others wondered whether the Ellingtons were truly the only ones, because while the Ellington farm had become infamous, it wasn't the only institution operating. In isolation, throughout the 1830s and 1840s, dozens of private orphanages, reform schools, and work farms ran under similar models. Publicly funded, privately managed, lightly inspected. Most of them, perhaps, did what they promised. But after Ellington, the question lingered, what if they didn't? The scandal sparked a wave of quiet investigations across New England. Inspectors arrived unannounced at other farms and homes. Some met with cooperation, others with doors slammed in their faces. In most places, they found nothing worse than overcrowding, poor sanitation, or outdated practices. But in a few rare cases, they found something worse. One such home in Connecticut was shut down in 1851 after an inspector discovered 3 unmarked child graves behind a barn. Another, in rural Vermont, was investigated after a whistleblower revealed that children were being sold as unpaid laborers to local landowners. That operation folded before charges could be filed. The director vanished. Each time, the Ellington name re-emerged, not in headlines, not in courtrooms, but in whispers. This place isn't another Ellington, is it? The name had become a benchmark, a warning, a ghost. And in many ways, it still is. As the decades passed, the Ellington case faded from textbooks. The documents remained locked away, unavailable to the public. Historians mentioned the scandal only in footnotes, if at all. And the cemetery grove became something of a local legend, a place school children dared each other to visit, where townsfolk claimed the air grew heavy and birds refused to sing. But not all forgot. In 1947, exactly 100 years after the graves were discovered, the sealed files were quietly reopened for scholarly research. What was found inside shocked even those familiar with the broad strokes of the case. Josiah's original journal, Constance's confessions, letters never sent, ledgers never published, testimony from children who'd survived early years at the farm before being removed, their memories ignored at the time, diagrams of the cellar rooms, notes from Mrs. Hartwell's personal diary, revealing that she'd feared for her own safety during her visit, but stayed silent out of strategy, believing too much force would make the state retreat instead of act. The documents painted a fuller picture, not just of what happened, but how it happened, how it was allowed, how it flourished, and how it was covered up, even after being exposed. Modern scholars call it organizational drift, the process by which good intentions, left unchecked, slowly erode into harm, where people stop asking, "Is this right?" and instead ask, "Is this efficient?" That's what Ellington became. A farm that started with the promise of charity and ended with a calculation. What is the acceptable death rate? The release of the files in 1947 sparked renewed interest in the case. Journalists wrote features. Documentarians pitched films. Academics published papers. For a moment, the country seemed ready to face what it had once tried so hard to forget. Just as quickly, it faded again, not because people didn't care, but because it was easier not to. The Ellington story isn't just disturbing. It's inconvenient. It asks us to question systems we still trust, to examine institutions we still rely on, to look at kindness, and ask if it's real, in the 1980s. A small group of historians and social workers launched a campaign to preserve the cemetery more formally. With state permission, they installed a new bronze plaque near the entrance to the grove. It reads, "This land remembers. Let us remember too." And some do. Each year, on October 15th, the anniversary of Sarah Brennan's death, the first child buried there, a candlelight vigil is held. Names are read aloud, not just of the 43, but of children who have gone missing from care systems across history. It's quiet, simple, but powerful, because memory, once spoken aloud, becomes something else. It becomes resistance. And if Ellington taught the world anything, it's this. Silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's the space where horror hides. The years rolled forward. The grove remained still. Grass grew tall in the fields that once echoed with the footsteps of barefoot children. The oak trees thickened with age, their roots reaching deeper into the ground, where stories had been buried alongside bones. And above it all, the names etched into white stone slowly weathered under rain, wind, and time. People passed the grove, sometimes stopping to read a name, sometimes not. But over time, even the most horrific stories begin to lose their edges. The images fade, the emotions dull, and what once felt like a national reckoning starts to feel like a distant tale, someone else's tragedy, long ago. That is the danger of forgetting, because Ellington wasn't just a place where bad people did bad things. It was a place where many people, good, kind, ordinary people, failed to act. It was a reminder that silence is not neutral. That belief without scrutiny is not virtue, and that evil can wear the face of charity, smile from the pulpit, and shake hands at town meetings. But memory is strange. It doesn't always live in books or monuments. Sometimes it lives in instinct, in unease, in the way someone pauses at the edge of the oak grove, unsure why they feel the air shift, in the teacher who insists on visiting every child welfare facility before recommending a student's placement, in the caseworker who writes one extra letter, makes one extra phone call, just in case. Because once, not long ago, no one made that call. The Ellington story wasn't passed down through bedtime stories or history classes. It lived in whispers, in footnotes, in sealed boxes. And for a long time, that seemed enough. But it wasn't. In 2003, a graduate student named Clara Lynn stumbled across the Ellington case while researching early American welfare policy. At first, she thought the records were mislabeled. An orphanage with a 95% placement success rate seemed statistically impossible. But the more she read, the more she uncovered. She requested access to the sealed documents, dug into court transcripts, interviewed descendants of officials and neighbors. She walked the overgrown property, stood in the grove, read each name out loud, took pictures of the stones, talked to the maintenance worker who came twice a year to trim the weeds and clean the plaques. What she found disturbed her. Not just the horror itself, but how easily it had slipped from public consciousness. She asked a local high school history teacher if her students studied Ellington. The woman blinked, then said, "That's the place with the trees, right? We mention it briefly in our social reform unit." One slide, maybe 2 paragraphs. Clara couldn't accept that. So she wrote a thesis, then a book, then a series of lectures. And slowly, the Ellington story began to echo again. Not loud, not viral, but steady. A professor in Vermont added it to her curriculum. A museum in Boston created a small exhibit. A podcast episode went unexpectedly viral. Teachers began assigning essays on child welfare reform. And for the first time, the students weren't just writing about laws. They were writing about children. Real ones. Timothy Caldwell. Sarah Brennan, Peter Hoffman, Mary Sullivan. The names had returned. One teacher, after playing audio from a survivor's testimony, wrote this on the whiteboard. If silence enabled this, what does that say about ours? And that question, that haunting, persistent question, became the centerpiece of a growing movement in academic circles. Studying the systems, not just the scandals. Because the truth is, Ellington was never a standalone tragedy. It was part of a larger pattern, one that spanned countries, decades, and generations. Boarding schools, work farms, reformatories, institutions built to fix children. Places where vulnerability was seen as weakness, where obedience was rewarded, and suffering explained away as discipline, where inspection reports meant more than first-hand accounts, where the language of care was weaponized to mask control. In one of her lectures, Clara Lynn said, "The Ellington children didn't die only from hunger. They died from belief, from a society that believed too much in paperwork, in performance, in the appearance of goodness. They died because the system trusted the system." That quote was printed in several newspapers after her talk. But what mattered more was what happened afterward. A bill was introduced in the Massachusetts legislature to establish August 18th, the day Timothy Caldwell died, as an official day of reflection for child advocacy workers. A new scholarship was founded in his name for students pursuing careers in child protection and reform. And, at long last, something else changed. The archives were digitized. Every page, every letter, every false progress report, and every heartbreaking confession. No longer locked in drawers, no longer bound by court seals. They were made public. Open to anyone willing to read them. And people did, because now there was a face on the story. Several faces. The photograph of Sarah Brennan, taken before she left Boston, showed a girl with bright eyes and crooked teeth. She wore a wool dress too big for her frame and held a string doll in her hand. A caption beneath it read, "Sarah, age 10, loved embroidery and lemon candies." It wasn't much, but it was something. In the years that followed, more families came to the grove. Not descendants. Few of the children had bloodlines left to trace. These visitors were strangers, but they brought flowers anyway. Lit candles, read names. Left paper cranes, handwritten notes, sometimes just quiet tears. They came because they believed remembrance was resistance, because they understood that forgetting is never neutral, and because they knew, deep down, that the line between then and now isn't as thick as we pretend. In a radio interview, Clara Lynn was asked why she had devoted so many years to telling a story most people wanted to forget. Her answer was simple: because they couldn't tell it themselves. There's something about walking through a place like Ellington Grove that presses on the lungs, a kind of invisible weight. The air moves differently. Sound carries farther. Even the sunlight, when it cuts through the trees, feels softer, distant, like it knows better than to shine too brightly. And maybe that's the most chilling part of the Ellington story. Not the cruelty, not even the deaths, but the echo. The idea that the story didn't end in 1847, that it didn't end with the graves, the trial, or the reforms. That, in 1,000 different ways, it's still with us, quietly shaping how we see systems, how we measure care, and how easily people disappear when we stop paying attention. Because the truth is, Ellington isn't just a place. It's a pattern, and the pattern is still alive. You see it in the headlines. Cases of abuse in modern institutions. Underfunded foster homes, group care facilities caught in scandal. Stories of children shuffled from place to place, their names lost in databases, their voices drowned out by bureaucracy. You hear it in the language too. Words like troubled, resistant, hard to place. The same phrases once used, to describe the children of Ellington. The same tone of polite dismissal. The same refusal to look deeper. But systems don't fail by accident. They fail because people let them. Because somewhere along the way, someone chose silence over confrontation. Paperwork over presence. Procedure over protection. Just like they did at Ellington when Josiah sent his first forged letter. When Constance halved a child's meal to teach obedience. When the town officials, overwhelmed and overworked, decided not to follow up each moment. Small, justified, forgotten until the graves. That's why the Ellington case still matters. Because it shows how monstrous outcomes are often born from ordinary choices. Not evil in grand strokes, but in everyday omissions. A call not made, a report not checked, a visit postponed. That's how horror hides, not in the shadows, but in the cracks. And yet, as much as Ellington exposes the worst, it also reveals something else. The power of one person to interrupt the silence. Mrs. Hartwell wasn't a politician. She didn't have wealth or influence. She had a notebook, a pen, and the instinct to ask a question no one else was willing to ask. Where is Timothy? That question broke the illusion. It opened the door that led to the fireplace, to the journal, too. The grove. Her voice didn't bring the children back, but it gave them back their names, their truth, and eventually their place in history. And that matters, because the line between then and now is not as wide as we like to believe. It's drawn every day by the choices we make. When a social worker fights for a child others have given up on, that redraws the line. When a teacher notices bruises and speaks up, that redraws the line. When a stranger cares enough to listen, to ask, to follow a feeling they can't explain, that redraws the line too. It's not always dramatic. It's often quiet, lonely, thankless, but it matters, because every time we pay attention, every time we remember, we make it harder for stories like Ellington to repeat themselves. And they do try to repeat. In corners of society we still overlook. In institutions we still romanticize. In systems where convenience is confused for care. That's the lesson Ellington leaves us with. That the greatest danger isn't just cruelty. It's comfort. Comfort with the idea that someone else is watching. Comfort with the assumption that it couldn't happen here. Comfort with distance. And the only thing that disrupts that comfort is courage. The kind of courage shown by Jacob Fletcher, the traveling tinker who refused to ignore what he saw. By the children who dared whisper to Mrs. Hartwell. By Clara Lynn, who told the story again when history tried to close the book. They weren't heroes in the way stories like to define heroes. They were inconvenient. They were stubborn. They refused to let the world forget what it wanted to. That's real heroism. The willingness to remember what others would rather erase. And that's where you come in. Because now, you've heard the names. You've seen the cracks. You've stood in the grove, at least in your mind, and understood what it meant to let those graves be unmarked for so long. What you do with that, that's up to you. Maybe you'll tell someone the story. Maybe you'll teach it. Maybe you'll carry it as a quiet reminder to look a little closer the next time you pass a place that seems too well run, or too quiet. Or maybe you'll simply remember, and maybe that will be enough, because memory is a strange kind of justice. Not enough to heal, but enough to mark the wound. To say, we see you now. To promise, it will not happen again. To whisper back to the children in the grove, you are not forgotten. And that is how stories like Ellington end, not with finality, but with someone listening, someone watching, someone choosing not to look away. Even now, as the wind moves through the trees and the old oak limbs creak in the dusk, the ground beneath Ellington Grove holds more than bones. It holds a promise that this time we will remember. There are places where time doesn't quite move forward, where the air feels heavier, where the ground feels older, and where the silence doesn't feel empty, it feels full. Ellington Grove is one of those places. There are no walls left. Number. Sounds of boots on wooden floors, no clang of Constance's breakfast pot in the dark. The mill wheel hasn't turned in a century. The fields don't grow anything now but weeds and wildflowers. And yet, it doesn't feel abandoned. It feels occupied. Not by people, but by memory. Walk among the 43 headstones, and it becomes clear. This isn't just a graveyard. It's a ledger carved in stone. Every name a debt that was never paid. Every date a question. Every missing last name a reminder of how easily identity can be erased. And yet, here they are, restored, remembered. Not through forgiveness. Not through forgetting. But through the telling. The Ellington story didn't begin as a legend. It began as a lie. A lie told with perfect handwriting, delivered by a man who knew exactly what people wanted to hear. He promised order, structure, redemption, and in exchange, he asked for only one thing. Silence. Silence from the children. Silence from the state. Silence from the good people of Massachusetts, who wanted to believe they were doing good without ever checking if good was being done. But the silence didn't last, because of a woman with a notebook, a child who whispered, a tinker who noticed, a scholar who rediscovered. And that's what remains. Not just the graves, not just the reforms, but the truth, the undeniable, uncomfortable truth that stories like Ellington don't disappear with the people who caused them. They linger, they shift, they adapt to new systems, new language, new faces. Today, the Ellington site is a state landmark. Visitors arrive quietly, most not knowing what to expect. Some have heard pieces of the story from a podcast, a lecture, an article long scrolled. Past, others come out of curiosity. But few leave unchanged. A sign near the grove welcomes them. It doesn't list names, or dates, or numbers. It says only this: they were here. And now, so are you. Every year, on the anniversary of the discovery of the graves, September 12th, a candlelight vigil is held. People gather with lanterns and music. No speeches, just names. Read aloud. One by one, some names are full, some are fragments. Some are still listed as unknown. But they are all spoken. And that, after everything, is what the Ellington children never had in life: to be seen, heard, counted. Clara Lynn, now a professor, still attends every year. She never reads from the journal or the reports. She reads from memory. Her voice, steady and soft, has become a kind of tradition, a thread between past and present. At last year's vigil, she brought something new, a letter. It had been written by Sarah Brennan's mother. Just before she died, the letter had never been mailed. It was found folded in a prayer book donated to a Boston charity. In it, she wrote, "To the woman who will care for my daughter, I hope you are kind. I hope you are patient. She is smart. She likes to hum while she sews. She frightens easily, but tries to be brave. Please keep her safe. Please let her keep her name." Clara didn't cry when she read it, but many others did, because it was the one thing that had never reached Ellington. A plea for gentleness, for dignity, for survival. It had been lost to time, like so much else, but no more. The Ellington story is now studied in universities, taught in training programs for social workers, cited in public policy courses, referenced in debates about privatized care, not just for what it was, a tragedy, but for what it revealed. That systems built without accountability will eventually feed on the people they're meant to protect, that the facade of morality can be far more dangerous than visible cruelty, that children aren't safeguarded by the appearance of safety, They are safeguarded by vigilance, not by listening, by discomfort, by asking again and again, is this working? And if not, why aren't we changing it? What remains of Ellington is not just a warning dot, it's a mirror, held up to every generation that comes after. A challenge to do better, to look closer, to never assume that care is occurring simply because someone says it is. And still, amid the policy lessons and historical analysis, there is the simple, human grief that lingers, the ache of what could have been. What if Sarah had lived? Would she have become a seamstress like her mother? Would Timothy have become a teacher? Would Mary Sullivan have grown up to write books? Would Peter Hoffman have sung in a choir, like he once whispered he wanted to? We don't know. We'll never know. And that is the real tragedy. Not just the lives that were lost, but the futures that were never written. But even in that ache, there is something that lasts. Not closure. Not healing. Something quieter. Acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, something powerful. A promise, spoken by those who visit, by those who remember, by those who refuse to let the silence return, that the children of Ellington are not just a case study. They are not just names in a ledger. They were here. They mattered. And they still do.